May the words of my mouth and thoughts of my heart be acceptable before you, O God, my rock, my redeemer. Shalom all and welcome. Buenas noches, bienvenidos everybody. This is the KosherTorah Open Forum, and I am, of course, your host, Ariel Tzadok. And you find me online at, well, where else? KosherTorah.com. We are learning in our present series from an excellent book which I highly recommend called Israel and Humanity. Readily available to us in English from the Classics of Western Spirituality series. It is written by Rabbi Elijah Benamozegh. I think it was published, what did we say, 1863 or something like that? Rabbi Benamozegh was an Orthodox, needless to say, Italian-Moroccan Kabbalist. It's a nice mixture of origins there. And the premise of this book, the subtitle of this course, is In Search of Universal Torah. A point that has been made in our previous lessons, and that we are going to continue now, was that the teachings of the Torah are something far beyond the limitations of just the Jewish religion. So much so that we are actually going to make a distinguishing. All right, we're going to separate between the Jewish religion, which is obviously meant for practice by Jews, and Universal Torah, which is the underlying teaching, not only underlying Judaism, but underlying all the religions of the world. And the common denominator of belief, idea, experience, is something that you will find documented in the world's religions, each in their own version or name. For an example, the way that we refer to the Universal Torah, Islam has the same concept of what they call the Universal Quran. The Christians have the concept of the Logos, right? The Word of God. You'll find a similar concept also in the Vedic teachings in India and the Buddhist teachings as well. While I am not as well versed in Native American or other teachings from around the world, the little that I have studied and explored seems to indicate that all systems have this common denominator. This common denominator seems to indicate what we could refer to psychologically as a common denominator of our humanity. And in our spiritual retreat series, we discuss a lot about that. From Jung, the concept of the collective consciousness and the like. Whereas Rabbi Benamozegh, our author, is not going in that direction. He is still nonetheless trying to emphasize to us that there is a universal reality, a universal truth, if you will, a universal spirituality. Notice I intentionally did not use the word religion. A point that I've made over and over, and I'm going to repeat. I believe it's high time that we separate religion from spirituality and put each in their proper place. Religion should be properly placed in the domain of politics, where it has always been and where it probably belongs. Spirituality needs to be placed in the domain of psychology, where it properly belongs. Because when you want to look for God, don't look for God on the pages of a book. Don't go looking for God in the ideas and thoughts of men. Look for God in the reality of that which God created. The human heart, the human soul, and everything in the natural world around us. There we will find echoed the concept of God. And before we go in to discuss exactly what this God is, which is the subject of our next chapter, which we're going to call the Uniqueness of God, there is one last section in the chapter 1 called the Unity of God, which I want to discuss and open up with. Rabbi Benamozegh opens up here with a discussion of Israel and the pagan mysteries. And he brings down out something that many a scholar has noticed. When you go into ancient traditions, you will find that there are curious similarities between many of their teachings. You go back into the ancient Chaldean, the ancient Assyrian, certainly the ancient Egyptian, and you put this side by side with the ancient Hebraic. This is pre-Rabbinic Torah, before you could even call it Judaism. And you will find that there are curious similarities, overlaps, which kind of question, or bring into question, what we would consider to be the absolute uniqueness or difference of Torah from the rest of the world around it. We are pretty much taught, I hate to say it, but I will, a religious lie. That's because I call it a lie because it's a deception. It's not even a mistake, which would mean that people aren't, aware, but they are aware. In biblical times, read your scripture. There was always an overlap of cultures, ideas, spirituality, and gods. If you remember even the famous example with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, okay? He reasoned with the people, saying, hey, let's have the debate. Let's have Baal's altar built, YHWH, Hashem's altar built, and wherever the fire comes down, that will be proof. And the people agreed. What kind of talk is that? My God's bigger than your God? My God's better than your God? Why would God acquiesce to that? Why would Elijah seek that kind of discussion? That kind of argument? Why don't you just proclaim loudly, the Lord is God, death to the infidels? It's not like we have a shortage of people who, say that. But the point is, the fact was that people were so ingrained in many a thing. And God tolerated it. He didn't wipe out all the people who believed in Baal. God made the effort to teach them something. He wanted them to see. This was an evolutionary process. All of human development is an evolutionary process. When Charles Darwin, back in the 19th century, and those with him, discovered what they called developments of species and the likes of what we call today evolution, modern secularists proclaim, well, that proves atheism. No, it doesn't. It doesn't prove anything of the kind. Charles Darwin certainly never postulated any such connection. In essence, the atheists have hijacked evolution. You'll read in the writings even of the likes of Rabbi Cook. There's nothing in evolution that contradicts Scripture at all. But then again, if your understanding of Scripture is limited to a literal reading of just the translation English, then obviously you're going to come to terrible mistakes. Your level of scholarship is sincerely and severely lacking. That's why we require education. And in education, when you come and recognize the origins of things, you recognize that things aren't so black and white and clear and definitive as we see, or as we wanted to see. And therefore we need to learn. So these ancient mysteries, Rabbi Benamozegh has some very interesting things to say about them, and I want to read to you what he says. He states here, and I'm reading from his book on the bottom page 77, if you want to acquire a copy of Israel and Humanities, it is available through Amazon.com. And I would appreciate and thank you if and when you do order the book from Amazon, that you could click onto Amazon through KosherTorah.com. They give us a little kickback for every book, for every bit of anything that you actually buy on Amazon. You can go buy toothpaste on Amazon. They'll give us a kickback. And we thank you again for your support. He says here, a glance at the pagan mysteries will enable us to understand very clearly the influence of paganism upon the educated class of Israel. I'm going to skip a little bit to the next paragraph, and he states, it is this demonstrable that in antiquity, whenever Israel pitched its tents, it encountered the pagan mysteries. In Egypt, as in Syria, as in Babylon, as in Persia, and in the Greek or Roman world. What precisely were these mysteries? Many hypotheses have been put forward with respect to both the historical sources and their essential nature. But what seems to us most definitively established is that they embodied, in forms suitable to the diversity of time and place which characterized their appearance, it embodied these religious teachings that are incomparably more pure and elevated than those of the popular cults, which were popular at the time. This is also, let me digress for a moment, true today. Many years ago, when I originally wrote about Vedic and Hinduistic teachings, I wrote from a position which I must confess, which was a very superficial and shallow understanding of them. And I wrote, as many of my Orthodox rabbinic peers, that they are forbidden, they are wrong, they're evil, they're idolatry, they're this and they're that, until I said, let me go and learn them correctly and see for myself. And boy, oh boy, was I shocked. For those people who believe that Hinduism is fundamentally and essentially pantheistic, well, that's wrong. First of all, there's a number of different forms of Hinduism, possibly as many forms as there are of Judaism. But underlying the Vedic teachings, there is a concept of what we call the God of Gods, the ultimate source. They have a concept of singularity similar to what we call in Kabbalah the Ein Sof. And when I learned, I had one of those harumph moments. And when you recognize that even in the Vedic Hindu culture, that many of what they describe is what we would use the Jewish term midrashic, meaning not literal, not historic, but actually, if you will, ethical, moralistic, epic style literature. Indeed, I've been reading recently the Bhagavad Gita. And I'm reading it again with that fine-tooth comb and skeptical attitude of a scholar and as an Orthodox rabbi. Remember we did the course a while back about an Orthodox rabbi reads the Christian Bible? Boy, oh boy, I cannot tell you how tempted I am to do a course entitled An Orthodox Rabbi Reads the Bhagavad Gita. Because there is much interesting teachings there, just like it was in Christianity. But another idea for another time. But my point that I'm trying to get at is this. I was glad to see that many of the commentators to the Gita are willing to say that it's not a historical rendition of a real Arjuna with a real Krishna on a real battlefield, on a real chariot, but rather it's a story, like many other stories. And the story is meant to teach a lesson. And like many other stories, we could say, once upon a time. Now, Harvey, you're making a comment correlating the concept of Krishna as Adam Kadmon. No. And that is because the concept of Krishna as a, if you will, divine incarnate, that was more like a logos incarnate from Christianity. But that's not what Adam Kadmon is in the Jewish tradition. That was a misinterpretation and a misapplication of the Adam Kadmon concept in Judaism. There is a concept what we call saints and ideas, what we call in Judaism, what John says, the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. That is actually a Jewish concept. However, it's not limited to a single individual. The Word of God is, if you will, the Spirit, the enlightenment, whatever. And it applies to anybody and everybody. That could mean you and me. Who, in the words of our famous Midrash Tana Devei Eliyahu Rabbah, chapter 9, for those who want to go look it up, where, according to legend, not history, Elijah the prophet says, man or a woman, Jew or Gentile, free or slave, everybody can receive Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit, divine inspiration. That is what it means to become, if you will, the Word of God walking among us, all in accordance to one's actions. Their spirit spirituality, God consciousness is an equal opportunity, open door for all of us. Maybe that's exactly what this Universal Torah, and I might add what the Messianic Torah, is all about. Let's go back into Rabbi Benamozegh. He says, a most significant consideration that when we reflect that the Jews, whose own religious beliefs were advanced in all respects, found themselves in touch with pagans who were knowledgeable in these esoteric mysteries, and in whom therefore they could not fail to take an interest. The resemblance between the doctrines of each was indeed so striking that the question must immediately suggest itself whether one had intimated the other. But perhaps on the whole, a better explanation is that we have here two versions of a still more ancient belief, like the radiance of a single light which is reflected in different surroundings in varied colors. This original oneness of doctrine corresponds to the original oneness of the human family. The diversity of religious expressions corresponds to the eventual fragmentation and differentiations of peoples. This is spoken years before Carl Jung spoke about the collective consciousness. And here he is. Bingo! He's got it. This is the point. You want to make a suggestion historically? Well, even though according to Kabbalah we know that Adam wasn't really the first human being, again, that's just a way the Torah describes it. But let's bring things up to the days of Noah. Right? We're all called the children of Noah because we say Noah survived the flood. Well, it seems to be that almost every culture around the world has a flood legend. Go look it up. Not only do we have the actual record of the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, readily available, translated in English, you will find that there are similar stories in the Hindu tradition, in the Chinese tradition, if I'm not mistaken, even in Native American and even Aborigine Australian tradition. I've heard it rumored. Well, somehow, somewhere, something's echoing from someplace. Let's move up in history. Abraham. Abraham, as we know, is very, very famous. Abraham's the father of Western monotheism. Judaism has long held that Abraham had a connection through his sons after Isaac, and that they traveled to the east, possibly becoming the Brahmin of the Vedic traditions in India. I don't know if that could ever be proven true or false. However, we are under the impression that indeed Abraham had a significant religious influence in his day. Well, what happened to it? Well, the Torah is not a history book to record that. But we do know that the Hyksos, hundreds of years later, popped up in Egypt. Where did they come from? Where did the ideas come from? Where did the ideas of the original ancient teachings come from? Where did they go? Especially when we have all kinds of claims to ancient mystery schools. Remember, in ancient Egyptian religion, you had an inner society of priests who didn't share their knowledge any more than the inner society of Kabbalists do with everyone else. Think about this. For those of you who have studied Kabbalah and understand it, do you think the rank and file of regular, everyday, religious, Jewish individual, practicing Jews, can understand it and put it into practice? I will tell you, after 30 plus years of experience, not only no, I will tell you, hell no. Now, you want to talk about Sephirot and Olamot and this and that? Sure, great, cool, go write the books, everybody does. But no one really gets to the point that these are psychological pathways for inner transformation. And most people are unwilling or afraid to make the effort inside themselves to change, to cultivate growth, maturity, transformation, that takes courage, which most people, in all due respect, don't have. That's why what we call the secret teachings had to be kept secret. Not that they're so sublime and holy and you are unworthy and you'll contaminate the teachings. On the contrary. This is, if you will, compared to PhD studies. If I have a book of knowledge at the PhD level, why would I bother giving it to a first grader? What can a first grader really understand out of it? It would be wasted. And therefore, you put it aside and wait until the people get to the proper level of education. But this is not education at the academic level. It's education at the psychological level. Let's continue. Rabbi Benamozegh says, the most rigorous Jewish orthodoxy cannot fail to recognize the influence of the Egyptian mysteries on the lawgiver of the Hebrews, Moses, and these borrowings in which rationalism has found a decisive objection to the Mosaic revelation appear to the contrary, like a ringing confirmation of our principles. Many people have noticed, there's a lot of similarity between what they taught in ancient Egypt and what Moses said. And then you'll have, crazy people like Sigmund Freud jumping to conclusions. Well, that means Moses was really an Egyptian and Torah is really Egyptian religion, which means we have no Judaism, so let's throw it away and have a new religion with me. Sigmund Freud is the new Messiah. That's pretty much what his Moses and monotheism was all about. Sigmund Freud needed to lie down on the couch and have Sigmund Freud analyze him, but what can we say? Continuing here, listen to this. Moses seized what was in the Egyptian religion, the sole possession of the hierarchic caste, and transferred it to Israel, a nation entirely priestly. Alright, he says circumcision, for example, which was the distinguishing sign of initiates, became the common law of the Jews. What had been the privilege of a few adepts was henceforth the heritage of an entire people, who thus became the priests of mankind. And let me reiterate, when it says in the Bible, God chose Israel. The Jews never proclaimed that. The Torah did. And what the Torah says, and everybody who is here, if you are Jewish and you pay attention, nowhere does God choosing Israel make Israel better than anybody else, smarter than anybody else. Anything. Not even closer to God. Israel is a mission, should you decide to accept it, like in Mission Impossible. Being a priest means being a servant. It means being a worker. It means being a tool. In essence, it's a hell of a hard job, which if you really could think about it, you might want to think twice about and say, thanks, but no thanks. And there's a lot of legends and discussions about that in the Talmud and Gemara, and juxtaposing the giving of the Torah at Sinai to Purim's story and everything else. But we're not going to get into that right now. But the issue is this. To be a nation of priests means that God works through you to bring light to the world. Remember Isaiah 41? Be a light to the nations. Therefore, if you are serving the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the God of Gods, and you seek to bring His truth to the world, whether you are Jewish or not, you are performing the mission of Israel. And if somehow in your heart you feel deeply that this is what you must do, that does not mean that you should seek out to convert to Orthodox Judaism, certainly not in this politicized day and age, but rather, it's possible that if we could trace back your genealogy, 2,000, 3,000, 500 years, maybe your ancestors did stand at Mount Sinai. Maybe there's something in your genes. Who knows? But this is the important point. Listen. Should we then be surprised that Judaism has been accused of forming a sort of Freemasonry? What is certain is that the theology of Freemasonry is quite similar to that of the Kabbalah. Isn't that interesting? We'll get to that in a minute. On the other hand, a careful study of the rabbinic literature of the first centuries of the Christian era provides numerous proofs that the Agadah, the legends, were the popular forms of a secret discipline whose initiation methods bore the most striking resemblance to Freemasonry. If we have any Masons here, I'm sure you're familiar with the famous stories of Hiram. You know, the great architect, the builder, and how he was killed by his servants and all the rest of that jazz. But these aren't necessarily historical stories. You could read about that in the Masonic literature. Is there a connection between Judaism as a religion and Masonry? Not really. No. But I will tell you this. There are a number of Jewish individuals, like Christian individuals, like Muslim individuals, who are Masons. Masonry is not this international underground conspiracy that's out to control the world and to put the mark of the beast on you and steal your soul and turn you over to the devil and all this other nonsense. Pretty much you'll find those people who are anti-Masonic are also anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and anti-American. The original Masonic teachings were actually good stuff. I have a great book here called The History of Freemasonry by Albert Mackey. And he has here an interesting chapter on the Noah and the Noahides. I believe it is chapter 42. And he has some very interesting revelations from old, original Masonic manuscripts about the Masonic connection to what they called Noahidism. It's got some very interesting stuff here. Let me quote to you from something called the Krauss manuscript. Under the head of the laws of obligations laid before his brother Masons by Prince Edwin. Alright? The first obligation, this is page 410 for those of you who want to look this up. The first obligation is that you shall sincerely honor God and obey the laws of the Noahide, because they are divine laws which should be obeyed by all the world. Therefore you must avoid all heresies, and not thereby sin against God. That sounds really interesting. The meaning is that the only religious laws which a Freemason is required to obey are those which are contained in the code which has been attributed to Noah. Alright? The Mason must obey the laws of the Noahide, that is, that he is to observe the 7 precepts of Noah, without being required to observe any other religious dogmas outside of these. Gee whiz. That's interesting. But you will find that the founding fathers of the United States of America created this country specifically to implement Masonic design. And for those of you who are familiar with the Great Seal of America, that's the symbol of the eagle, you have all kinds of numerical pictorial symbols referencing God's name, Yud-Keh, Vav-Keh, and the concept of unity. The whole number of 13, you remember there were originally 13 states? Why 13? Why not 12? Why 13? Why not 14? 13, as we know, is a very significant number in Judaism because it is the numerical value of the Hebraic word Echad, which is the foundation of the proclamation of the name of God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is Echad, one. And you have a lot of other interesting Masonic connections. Benjamin Franklin, founding father of the United States, called himself a Noahide by name. When you study the teachings of Thomas Jefferson, and he was a very prolific author, very interesting stuff. If you ever read Thomas Paine, who was a deist, he's the guy who wrote, Common Sense, and, these are the hard times that test the man's soul kind of stuff. That's Thomas Paine. He wrote some really weird stuff. He's very anti-religious because he was a deist. He even wrote about extraterrestrials and stuff like that. That's back in the 1700s. He was a guy out there. George Washington, remember, first president of the United States? He took his oath of office in full Masonic regalia. The Universal Torah teachings, which were embraced by the Masons, were set to as an establishment for the United States of America. That is the evolution of politics and society. And in all due respect to the reality of politics, it's a far cry to claim that the United States ever lived up to those great values. Right from its start, we all know that. But that's besides the point. We have to separate between the ideal and the reality, and of course continue to work towards the ideal. Now, interesting thing about the Masons, curiously interesting thing about the Jews, is that they share a common enemy. Needless to say, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has long considered those Antichrist Masons to be connected to those Antichrist Jews, and on and on. And that is the foundation of the modern day conspiracy theories nonsense. Alright? You know something? I think this is a quote from Yeshu, even though I don't mean to describe any specific authenticity to Yeshu, but it said in his name, and our sages say you're supposed to quote from a source, so I do. You will know them by their fruits. And if you know, as they say, fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. Alright? And like Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name still smell as sweet. So if you would see something, a conspiracy theory where they're pointing a finger at somebody or something, don't look to where the finger is pointing. Look at who's doing the pointing. And you might find a lot more to be suspicious about by the one who's doing the name calling than the one to whom they're calling names. So, with all due respect, while the Masonic orders, I am sure, have their own problems, just like Jewish orders do and everything else, the original ideals and concepts seem to be part of this universal concept, which Rabbi Benamozegh is noticing way back in the 1860s when he wrote this book. So, moving right along, we are convinced that those who would take the trouble to examine carefully this question of the relationship of Judaism and philosophical Freemasonry, and the mysteries in general, would be less disposed to hold the Kabbalah in disdain, and would even consider seriously the possible role which Kabbalistic theology may have to play in the religious developments of the future. Skipping a bit, he states here that Kabbalah contains the key to the fundamental problems of modern religion. And I cannot agree more. Now, when I say Kabbalah, I'm not referring to a literal reading of the Zohar or the writings of the Ariel. Anybody who looks to these things as literal is being ridiculous. You actually have Kabbalah cults out there, one of whom who has elevated the Zohar to a level of sanctity higher than that of the Torah itself. And they, perpetuate all kinds of myths and fantasies about reading the Zohar, scanning the Zohar, and the likes of this nonsense, which not only has no foundation in Judaism, certainly has no foundation in psychology, and certainly no redemptive powers to the individuals involved. Now, that's the point that we have to focus on. We must understand that what original Torah mysticism, the original and authentic Kabbalah was this universal teaching. What exactly is this universal teaching that I've been harping on all this time? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into when we discuss chapter 2, which we're going to start in just a minute. Because even though we proclaim unity, when you learn Kabbalah, and you learn about Sephirot, the divine emanations, and the different worlds and the different levels, that's all theory, philosophy. You will find that type of philosophy is very similar to the Samkhya philosophy that you'll find in Vedic teachings and in Ayurveda, coming out of India, and very similar to what we call Neoplatonism, from the likes of Plotinus and other Greek philosophers. Yeah, they actually talked about the same thing using not so dissimilar language. needless to say, I'm not the first one to have recognized it. You have scholars who've recognized this stuff for over a century. But aside from that, the original Torah, mysticism, should I call it that, was an experience, was a practice of psychological and spiritual maturity. You don't find it in the Zohar, but you do find it in the Talmud. You find it in the tractate Hagigah. You'll find it echoed in the experience of the four who went up to the Pardes. You will find it echoed in numerous other teachings of the sages and the rabbis. It was entirely a different set of teachings. They called it the Shiur Koma, the Ma'aseh Merkava. All these different types of experiential interactions with higher realms and levels of consciousness, touching ultimately to God. And this is exactly what we find to be this real common denominator between all these older ancient teachings. And when Rabbi Benamozegh is saying that Kabbalah contains now the key to the fundamental problems of modern religion, he's not referring to the philosophical elements. Even though those philosophical elements are common denominators, they are still denominators of thought, idea. And ideas are like opinions. And opinions are, shall we say, similar to a certain body part. Everybody's got one, if you know what I mean. You will never convince the world to believe philosophically the same. It's just not going to happen. We all know it. Different strokes for different folks. We learned about that when we discussed in our Shar HaGilgulim series that there are, as we say, a metaphorical number, 600,000 interpretations of Torah, each at the four levels, or 2,400,000 ways to look at Torah. Good, fine, nice. But experience, like we say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. How many words is an experience worth? If you actually, physically, historically stood at Mount Sinai, and you saw, felt, experienced what happened there, where your DNA was altered through some type of harmonic resonance, where you received direct telepathic communication from something beyond our earth. That is an experience which you couldn't put in the words, but everybody's standing there with you. If it was 2-3 million human beings, didn't have to share a word because they all got it. When we experience this, there's nothing more to say because you got it. That is the original Kabbalah. That is the universal religion. That is the answer to the fundamental problems of modern religion. And this will be what we call the Torah of Mashiach. Right out of Jeremiah 31, where it says, all men will know me from the least to the greatest, small to big, right? Everybody will know. We rabbis are going to be out of a job. I'm not going to teach anybody anymore because everybody's going to know. And what exactly are we going to know? Well, I thought you'd never ask. Chapter 2. The Uniqueness of God. Rabbi Benamozegh opens. Says here, we must wonder how it could have been that in times of ignorance and barbarism and hatred amongst people, that men without any philosophical culture could have risen to conceptions higher than those of Socrates and Plato. Have you ever studied ancient Greek philosophers? Have you ever studied Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato? These guys are deep thinkers. Kind of gives you a headache even to sit and where do they come up with these ideas and thoughts? And these guys lived in such a time and a place that we would have considered by modern standards primitive. Many of you might have heard of an old Jewish Prime Minister of England called Benjamin Disraeli. I remember once he was subject to an anti-Semitic comment in the House of Parliament in England. And he responded. And he says, while the good gentleman's ancestors were ritual, human sacrificing pagans, my ancestors were serving as priests in the temple of God built by King Solomon. There was a sophistication, a level of enlightenment, a level of profundity in the message of what Torah was teaching about God. Now this is what's important. When you go into all the religions of the time, even in the Vedic teachings, even in Buddhism came later, in which there was a concept of what we call the God of gods, or the highest God, the most high God. We're familiar with that concept right from the Bible, in the book of Genesis. Abraham worshipped the most high God by offering to the most high God's priest Melchizedek. Remember, Melchizedek honored El Elyon. But if you had El Elyon, you would have Elohim Tachtonim, lower gods. How about it, my biblical scholars? Is there any reference to other gods in the Bible? I ought to play the Jeopardy music now, give you time to think about it. The answer, of course, is yes. Right? You are not supposed to go after the other gods, Elohim Acharim. Right? Who are they? What are they? Well, that is all obviously subject to the interpretation of the commentators. Some will refer to them to being just false ideas and beliefs. Others will say that they're the forces of nature, and yet thirds will say that they're angels, and others will say they are the angelic representatives of the nations. Somebody's asking a question here in text about the gods of Olympus. Zeus, Apollo, Hera. Well, we can equally ask about the gods of the Norse. What about Odin and Thor? I mean, in all due respect, maybe what we're seeing in the Marvel, movies today, maybe there's some reality to it. Obviously, I'm being facetious. But yet, this has been addressed by rabbis. Is it possible that the stories of what we call the heavenly Sanhedrin, the angelic guides over the nations as ordained by God in our Jewish beliefs, that they very well might also be understood as the, in quote, gods of the nations, and their interactions recorded in the legends of the nations, a la the stories of Olympus or Asgard? My answer is a question mark. It's possible. I mean, I certainly don't know. I don't know that anybody could ever prove or disprove it. But from the point of legend, it says, and it can very well interact with one another. But the Israelite conception of divinity, Rabbi Benamozegh says here, right, is very, very profound. He writes here at the bottom of page 80, "The God of Israel is uncreated. Before me no God was formed. I am the first, I am the last. From him alone all things derive their existence, and he owes his own existence to no one. His most ancient name is El Shaddai. It indicates power, indeed omnipotence. And if the second of these has another meaning as well, is that one still more exalted and metaphysical. He is eternal. The heavens and the earth and all that they contain grow old." And he's quoting here numerous Psalms, right? "For I fill the heavens and the earth, declare the Lord. The heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool." Famous verses that we know. Again in Isaiah, "Holy, holy, holy, the Lord of hosts. The whole world is full of his glory." Which Rabbi Benamozegh translates, he says, could rather and should be read, "All which fills the earth is his presence." He calls that a more exact translation. Right? Very important here. Why? Because if and when, let's go back to the ancient gods. People are writing about gods like Dagon and all the rest. Well, if you go back into the ancient traditions and you read about the ancient gods, And there are books on Mesopotamian and Egyptian mythologies, just like Greek mythologies and Norse mythologies. You don't have a concept of a transcendent, absolute creator of existence who interacts with us. This is a radical concept. The concept which today we understand and explain through our theoretical metaphysics, right? There's a Arich Anpin, there is a Ze'er Anpin, a higher face, a lower face, the transcendental God, the incidental God. You have all these different ideas. But they didn't talk like this 3,000 years ago. These are hundreds of years before, and really started in Greek with Pythagoras. Remember Pythagoras? How many of you remember the Pythagorean theorem? You remember your algebra? A squared plus b squared equals c squared? That's Pythagoras. Pythagoras, the ancient Greeks were very much involved with numbers. They looked at the universe as being a big mathematical puzzle. They coined the term sacred geometry, a version of which we have in Judaism today called gematria, from geometria, in which we superimpose letters for numbers and numbers for letters, and therefore look for mathematical clues between equal equations of letters. It's pretty much what it is. There is historical record in the Pythagorean writings. It's available. It's available to this day. I've seen it. I have it in books. That Pythagoras himself was a traveler. He traveled to ancient Egypt. He traveled to Mount Carmel to study with the children of the prophets. So it is clear that he had a Torah Hebraic connection. How much of that Torah Hebraic connection influenced Pythagorean teachings? I don't know. How much of that possible influence of Torah upon Pythagoras filtered down to Socrates, to Plato, and eventually down to the Neoplatonists? I don't know. It's getting down to the interesting question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the Torah teachings or the mystery school teachings? Who learned what from who? There is interesting discussion that can take it both ways. But the point is, Rabbi Benamozegh says very clearly here at the bottom of 81, that now, right, no such of a notion could have come into polytheism. Right? This is completely incompatible. You have a concept of gods. We got that. Right? There are always concepts of gods. Alright? But what is God in Judaism? Oh, the Creator. Okay, got it. What's God's name? Bill? George? Frank? Bobby? Jesus? Krishna? None of the above. What's his name? Come on, say his name. I dare you to say his name. You can't. Because the foundation of Judaism is we don't know how to pronounce God's name, which is actually not true, and I wrote a whole thing about it, but Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei. We call it the name, or in Hebrew, Hashem. What the heck is that? Hannah in text is saying, I am that I am. The famous name, Ehyeh Sher Ehyeh. That's not a name. That's a riddle. It's actually, I will be what I will be. That's a name? What kind of name is that? Look, I'm going to name my kid, I will be. Right? Fill in the blank. That's a name? What kind of name? What is the concept behind such an expression? You think about it. We all know, I wrote this in my book, Call Upon My Name, 25 years ago already. Yud-Kei Vav-Kei comes from the root Hebrew verb ho-vei, H-Hey-Vav-Hey, which means to be. And anybody who knows anything about Hebrew grammar knows, you take a root, you put the letter Yud in front of the root, and it turns it from the passive to the active tense. God's name would translate as active being, being in action. God's name means being. And indeed, right here, Rabbi Benamozegh discusses this on page 82. He says, how can we imagine an image for unique being whose infinite attributes are infinite in his number, or whose ministers and angels are without number, to use the language of the Bible? He says they assert monstrous idols, multiple phantasaical images of paganism. They bear witness to the impossibility. And in a well-known passage, he's quoting here an Egyptian guy named Strabo, that Moses forbade the physical representation of God because his God was nothing less than the totality of things, nature. Is God nature? Well, if you were going to define things a la George Lucas, you could say God is the force. But George Lucas's interpretation of the force is that life creates the force, rather than the force creates life. Now, this is the interesting thing. We don't call God nature. Even Rabbi Benamozegh says Strabo erred in this respect. He didn't understand the concept of immanent divinity. What are we talking about? Well, we look at God being a consciousness, a presence, an awareness, a being. I don't know what else to refer to it. In the Kabbalah, in the theoretical school, we refer to it as the without end. We say that it has no name, no form, no image, no letter can be used to put together a word to describe it. God is ultimately indescribable. And, as Mary here is saying in text, not nature, but the essence behind nature. That's it. You got it. Bingo. And yet, everything comes forth from God. So like Rabbi Benamozegh said on our previous page here, all which fills the earth is His presence. This is the concept of the Universal Torah. In Judaism, we describe it like this. We state, in the beginning, God gazed into the Torah, and from the Torah, He created the world. If you are a Muslim, you substitute Quran for Torah. If you are a Christian, you substitute Logos for Torah. It's the same concept. Let's not argue theology. The same concept, that's what counts. God had a pre-existing plan. And that pre-existing plan, you'll find existing in the Vedic tradition. You find it existing in all the other traditions, called by different names. Right? And this is what's so curious about the connections. And this is the essence. That the one singular source is like what Rabbi Benamozegh says was the original light, and everything comes forth from it, using my words, like the spokes coming from the wheel, each one going off in their own way. It is what Jung referred to as the racial subdivisions in the collective unconscious. And this is what we all must focus on. This is why you and I are different, and yet we're the same. Whereas you and I are unique, whereas we're all ultimately the same. When we look out to the universe and we see the multiple differences and variations, we must recognize that underlying them all, there is a singularity which connects everything. This was a concept that was introduced by the Torah. And now he states something interesting. It's important to observe that God's attributes are not deduced from a well-defined theological system. They appear rather as intuitions resulting from prayer and worship, what we would call meditation. This very absence of philosophical speculation is an evidence of the religious genius of Israel. Now that's an interesting statement. Whereas, like I said earlier, you have the philosophical discussions, whether it be in Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, whether it be in the Vedas or Samkhya, or whether it be in the Zohar or the Arizal. Words, ideas, talk. Rabbi Benamozegh refers here to prayer and worship, which we can call meditation and experience. For those who know, you have an experience of the unity that underlies us all. And then you come to recognize the good that exists within. Within where? Within everything. And it's concealed, covered, caked over by what in Kabbalah we call klipa. Psychology, they'll call it shadow. In other systems, they'll call it by other words and other names. So be it. But that's what it is. Rabbi Benamozegh states here at the top of page 83, the divine attributes which the scriptures reveal to us, like the accounts of the events of Genesis and in the teachings of Kabbalah, do not form part of a definite harmonious system. Because as we've said, one must see in them an intuition of the religious soul of Israel. But whether we take each one separately or bring them together, they all declare that the existence of the unique and absolute God. I want to quickly get into one of the last thing here when he states, one thesis favored by certain critics recognizes in the religion of Israel a supreme God, but one whose supremacy does not exclude the existence of other less powerful deities who preside over the destinies of other people. But even if we should be attracted to this theory, that would still not prove the Jewish belief was ultimately not monotheistic. In fact, the conception of the superior God over the lesser divinities are dependent. They suggest the idea of an articulate structure in which the lower functions are organized under the direction of the sovereign authority. That has never been denied in Judaism. As a matter of fact, it's always been acknowledged. So you see, even though there is the concept of multiplicity, there is the underlying unity. And it is that underlying unity, this uniqueness of God, which is essentially and ultimately the actual truth of what we're referring to here as this universal concept. Alrighty. I'm going to stop here before we go on. I just am marking my book here to the place where we're going to discuss more about the singularity, more about these teachings, because it's important for us to recognize this so that we as human beings can take the very difficult but necessary step here, like Rabbi Benamozegh said about healing the problems of modern religion. We have to look for the common denominator. We have to look for the threads that bind us rather than burn the bridges that divide us. We have to be the ones that reach out and look to build the bridges. Because in our world in which everything is literally burning, dividing, destroying, we have to be the builders. That's actually one of the foundational moralistic teachings of the Torah. Do not consider yourselves the bonaich, the banaich, which means don't consider yourselves to be as if the children of God, but rather the builders for God. This is the message, the proclamation of the singularity of everything in existence, which is the singularity of being, which is the singularity of God, which is the foundation of the proclamation of Judaism. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But it's not theology. It's an experience. And it's an experience that we need so desperately to embrace internally. And that's, of course, why we teach the other courses like Spiritual Retreat, the other meditative teachings, so as to give you the practical techniques and tools to do just this. Okay, on that note, let's stop here, and with grace of God, Zat Hashem, as we say, we'll pick up in our next class and move forward. So again, thank you again all for joining me. I am your host, Ariel Tzadok. Come see me online at KosherTorah.com. See you all in our next class. Good night. Buenas noches. Shalom. 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 Buenas noches. Shalom.